Above our heads are 11,500 satellites circling the planet, forecasting our weather, delivering our internet, monitoring the natural environment, providing GPS, and allowing us to communicate in life-threatening emergencies, even from some of the remotest points across the globe. Soon, they might also support driverless cars and smarter agricultural technology, and that's just here on Earth. Humanity's sights have returned to the moon and are looking beyond as well. All this at a time when technology is emerging and capabilities are being created that we didn't even know were possible. However, all of this is not coming without risks. Consider satellite collisions, or runaway satellite collisions, and the small risks involved every single time we launch humans and cargo, events which are becoming more and more frequent. Nevertheless, the space sector is growing, and who wants to be at the very forefront of it? The United Kingdom. But why? And perhaps more crucially, how? How is the UK going to be a major player in the space sector? And how will it act to get there? With reckless abandon to make up for lost time? Or is it going to play a longer game? Perhaps looking into certain industries that otherwise might be overlooked. Let's find out. On the 16th of May 2024, the UK's Department for Science, Innovation and Technology released its Space Regulatory Review of 2024. The aim of this review? To ensure that the UK continues to offer an attractive, agile and competitive regulatory environment for space. Or in other words, to continue to keep policies up to date so that the UK is an appealing place to launch your space business. But hang on, what does it mean continues to offer a regulatory environment? Is the UK already a significant influence in matters of outer space? Well, yes. The UK lays claim to having one of the most advanced space regulatory regimes in the world, which includes its 2018 Space Industry Act and the 2021 Space Industry Regulations, but that's just the recent stuff. The UK has been licensing satellite operations since 1986 under the Outer Space Act, and it has the second highest number of satellites registered with the United Nations after the United States. Coming back closer towards the present though, in July of 2021, the UK took its Civil Aviation Authority, which already existed, and within that created an independent regulatory body, which was essentially your all-in-one place to be licensing launch, orbital and re-entry activities, and for licensing spaceports. Since then, it's issued 2 spaceport licenses, one to Saxonwold in Scotland, which hasn't had too much activity there yet, and one in Cornwall, which has. In January of 2023, it saw the UK's first ever space launch from its very own soil. Now, on top of all of this, the UK has also enabled a world-first mission of active debris removal. This to help clear away debris that's littering the sky, but we'll get back to that. The UK has also played a very active role in shaping the United Nations long-term sustainability guidelines for space, on the basis that international agreement is essential for driving up standards of safety, security and sustainability. To round things off back home though, estimates suggest that the UK secured approximately 17% of all private investment into the global space sector in 2022. Plus, the UK space sector also employs 47,000 people. So yeah, the UK has found its place in space, and better yet, it's keeping up the pace. It has set its eyes on the emerging in-orbit economy. Now, this can take the shape of company-operated satellites servicing customers, perhaps to refuel or even repair other satellites. And this technology is just paving the way for even more advanced capabilities, things like in-space assembly and manufacturing, and potentially even the development of space-based solar power. In fact, the groundwork for that is already being set, with the UK-based company Space Solar trying to achieve space solar. Anyway, by 2030, the in-orbit service market is estimated to have a market value of around £3.5 billion, and the UK is well placed to capture between 18 to 28% of that, resulting in around £800 million of cumulative revenues by 2030. Of this, somewhere between £87 and £134 million is expected to come from the UK's active debris removal systems.
Okay, let's actually talk about this for a moment, because this perfectly encapsulates the sort of values that this report is leaning into so much. Our orbit has a debris problem. Now, we already know that we've been sending up a lot of satellites. There are currently 11,500 satellites in orbit, only of which about 9,000 are functioning, leaving about 2,500 defunct satellites. But that's not all. There's also a pool of debris, approximately 35,000 items being tracked, anything from broken up satellites to old defunct rocket launch bodies to even tools that astronauts have dropped whilst they're in space. But that figure of 35,000 is only the amount of items that we are tracking. There are many, many more smaller pieces that we can't track because, well, they're too small. In fact, if we're counting pieces of debris larger than 1 millimeter, some models suggest that there could be as many as 130 million of them. Remember that these pieces of debris are travelling very, very fast in order to stay in orbit. And so, as a result, you don't want them colliding with your satellites because they could do a lot of damage and potentially create more debris. There is a hypothesized scenario known as Kessler syndrome, where perhaps two satellites, whether one's functioning or not, collide into one another and release lots of debris. That debris then might go on to hit into more satellites, creating more debris and a chain reaction, which would in this scenario wipe out all of our satellites, and given how much we rely on satellites for, that wouldn't be good. And the worst thing about it, we wouldn't even be able to send up replacements, because even if the satellites were broken, they wouldn't necessarily all fall down quickly either, and so we might not actually be able to send anything back up into orbit for generations. Not so good. That's why we have to be very considerate of the number of satellites that we send up into orbit, as well as what we do when they need repairing or when they reach the end of their lives. We can send satellites back down through the atmosphere in order to burn up upon re-entry and clear them up, but that assumes that we still have control of them. Otherwise, we're going to need ways to actually remove debris, perhaps by capturing them or by giving them a little shove in the right direction towards the atmosphere. That is where space regulation comes in, as it promotes sustainability in how we use space, whether it be ensuring that we have means to decommission satellites or encouraging companies who want to do something about cleaning up the debris that is already there. Now, the UK has taken the position that any space market should discourage a regulatory race to the bottom, where regulations get thinner and thinner and risks increase. So rather than allowing companies to cut corners in a way that might make them a quick buck but ultimately is very high risk and not even sustainable, regulations are in place to allow the longevity of the space sector. So ultimately, space regulation allows us to do space right.
That brings us back to the UK Space Regulatory Review for 2024, which had 3 jobs. First, to give an overall assessment of the UK Space Industry Act and to give an impression of how the new licensing scheme was going. Second, to identify gaps and solutions in current and future planned space activity where regulation or deregulation might be useful. And third, to set out an implementation plan for the improvements that it sees fit. The report brought together over 300 experts from across 100 organisations, spanning finance, industry, academia, science and insurance. And when all was said and done, a strong, unified message came to the forefront. The need for clarity, certainty and confidence in order for the UK to remain competitive in matters of outer space. Clarity of which recommendations are applicable to the space industry and what standards are required to be followed. Certainty of what support the UK will provide the space industry, as well as that it will receive continued support throughout the long lead time required for space technology development. From this then, confidence will emerge in developers, investors and international operators to invest in, move to and operate within the UK. This then will form a competitive, business-friendly regulatory environment in the UK, which encourages innovation but in a sustainable, exemplary way. In order to achieve these outcomes in the future, though, the report has found some things that the UK needs to focus on now. Specifically, it provided 7 themes that would, if fully implemented in regulations, deliver the greatest impact for the sector, the economy, and all of us who benefit from space. And within those, there were a whopping 17 recommendations. Are we doing all of these? Are we doing all of these? Okay, quick as we can. Here goes. In the name of agility and streamlining regulation, the UK can improve transparency by publishing a clear breakdown of the roles and various government bodies involved in space regulations. It can clarify its priorities, so independent regulators who license out projects can make swifter decisions, and it can work with those regulators to drive out duplicate demands of information to reduce the time, cost, and complexity of license applications. And it can support the establishment of cross-regulatory associations, both at home and internationally, so that different regulators between different countries countries and within the UK can promote common interests. To encourage innovation, the UK should support new and emerging missions and technologies. It can do this by establishing sandboxes where businesses can experiment with new tech under supervision, rather than being barred from doing it altogether by outdated regulations. Plus, the UK can publish clear policy and guidance signalling its priorities in emerging areas such as AI and quantum technology, which will inevitably cross over with space. Growth is encouraged by healthy competition, risk-taking investment, and good practice, whilst driving out irresponsible behaviours. So to do that, the UK can be rewarding responsible space system developers with financial tools and incentives, which has the side benefit of supporting a level playing field. Plus, there's a need to sharpen the UK's messaging that, hey, we have incentives and some very forward-leaning space regulation. Come bring your business over here to make use of all of this. Now, international partnerships are also something to be valued and fostered to align best practices. Therefore, a diplomacy package and continued work with the UN to smoothen trade within the space sector will be critical. As we touched on previously, safety and sustainability is really important to the UK in this context, in order to protect the space environment, celestial bodies, and freedom to act in safe, secure, and sustainable ways. That said, space sustainability still needs a published definition, as does guidance for best practices. Plus, guidance for how to even develop sustainability standards will be needed too. Hey, the regulators need some instruction too. Accessibility in this context means having coherent, easy-to-understand legislation that all types of organisations can interpret and operate under. The benefits and risks of targeted amendments to current legislation in the long term, especially any merging or refocusing of applicable acts, needs to be considered. Plus, there's a need to be continuously improving the regulations rather than a once it's done approach. And on top of this, a cost-benefit analysis needs to be undertaken for licensing entities with no financial or developmental interests in the UK. Finally, we're getting there, the space sector must operate within the national interest and in a way that supports national security. The Earth observation data security policy needs an update to encompass wider space data security regulations. National security and interest needs to be embedded into all licensable space activities, alongside guidance for how applicable or not these regulations are for government-sponsored space activity. Finally, appropriate requirements for security and protection of space systems and their data need developing. Though it's not mentioned specifically in this section of the report, based off of other mentions, this could encompass the allocation of different areas of the electromagnetic spectrum to different uses and how to safeguard those, similarly to how, say, there are different radio wave channels for different purposes here on Earth. Wow, okay, let's take a breath, because that was a lot. Now, how is all of that going to be implemented? The Department for Science, Technology and Innovation will be establishing a cross-government implementation team. This team will be tackling this list of recommendations in 3 phases. Phase 1 will be further assessment of the recommendations, as well as prioritising them. Phase 2 will be designing action plans for each outcome, to-do lists, they'll be making to-do lists. And Phase 3 will be delivering on those action plans, doing their to-do lists. Progress on major milestones will be reported back to the government, but ultimately the government can't be expected to implement all of this on its own, and will likely lead into its international partners to help build all of this groundwork. Nevertheless, all of this will set the UK up to be a big player in the in-orbit economy, making launches, servicing satellites, and clearing orbit, as well as tapping into the finance and insurance industries already very, very well established in London to carry across to the space sector. Yes, the UK is expecting to tap into the massive finance and insurance sector that is the hub of the City of London, and applying this to the space sector. It's a growing new industry after all, and there will be a need for finance and insurance. Perhaps the best thing about all of this, though, whether it be the work being done in London or in Cornwall, Scotland, or in orbit, is that it's all being done in a carefully considered way. The motivation is growth of the space sector and the economic benefits that that will have. But safety, security, and sustainability are words that are repeated time and time again throughout this report as the UK's chief aims in space. This report came as the Science Minister, Andrew Griffith, and the Defence Minister, James Cartledge, visited the UK Space Command to launch the National Space Operations Centre. This centre brings together almost 70 military and civilian personnel to protect the UK against space-related threats, hazards, and risks, like satellite collisions. Major voices across the industry have welcomed this opening, as well as the review document. Paul Bate, the CEO of the UK Space Agency, described the combination as a clear signal of the UK's ambitions to be a leading space nation, and many others have welcomed the outcomes and actions that the report has produced. To conclude all this though, Joanne Wheeler, a very qualified individual in the field, might have provided the best summary of what has to happen next. The UK has a strong reputation for law, regulation and policy across industries to catalyse investment and growth. The space industry has called upon the government to further support it through enabling agile, growth-driven, sustainability-focused regulation, and through the Space Regulatory Review, the government has stepped up. The UK now needs to be bold and proficient in its implementation of the outcomes of this review in an increasingly competitive international environment, anticipate innovation, and lead. Thanks for watching this episode of Science Affairs. We really went further afield with this one compared to previous episodes, so it would mean the world if you could like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share the video around as well. We hope to see you in the next one.
I can say this. Back to you in the studio. Yeah!